Okay, so welcome everyone. It is my absolute pleasure to welcome today Dr. Ramon Harvey to the 8th week of our senior seminar on Muslim prophetology. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, this is a series of seminars where we have invited a number of scholars who have spoken to various areas of that conduct research on Muslim conceptions of prophetology, be that from a theological point of view or from the devotional practices or the normative tradition, Islamic tradition that relates or is grounded in the prophetic persona. This seminar series is organized by the Chair for Hadith Studies and Prophetic Traditions here at the Center for Muslim Theology at Tübingen University, and specifically by Professor Ruggero Vimercati and myself. So we are very happy to have as our guest today Dr. Ramon Harvey, who is a lecturer at the Cambridge Muslim College in the United Kingdom. He is the author, for those of you who are not familiar with the work of Dr. Harvey, he is the author of Transcendent God and Rational World, al-Maturidi Theology, and more recently, the Quran and the Just Society. Although I think I got that wrong. I think the Quran and the Just Society came out first. Yeah. There are 6 more sessions. So those of you who have joined us today for the first time, we hope that you are going to continue to join us for the coming sessions, which is 1 more this year in December, and then we'll meet again in January. So without taking more time, we're very, very happy to have Ramon here. Thank you very much, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Besnik. So I am going to speak about the early development of the Maturidi tradition in relation to prophetology, prophethood, or prophecy. And specifically, I want to draw together a perspective on the function and proof of prophetic messengership in a general theological sense within the early development of the Maturidi school of Kalam. I will argue today that a common feature of the early expression of the school is that the sending of messengers is necessary, is deemed to be necessary due to divine wisdom, and that this means that it is rationally intelligible even in the absence of revelation, which kind of makes sense if revelation is itself being brought by the prophets. This perspective, I will suggest, is realized in varying degrees from major figures in the early Samarkandi school. Specifically, I want today look at al-Maturidi himself, who the eponym of the school, and of course Abu Salama al-Samarkandi, the author of Jumul min Usuluddin. And I want to show how this perspective is confirmed by what I'm calling early classical figures, al-Bazdawi, Abu Yusr al-Bazdawi, and Abu al-Mu'in al-Nasafi. And I want to show in the latter 2 figures that there is the beginnings of some competing ideas from, we could say, another perspective, perhaps a more Ash'ari perspective on this matter, as well as after al-Maturidi himself, some issues or problematics that emerge because of a shift in divine action model, in a shift towards specifically to an occasionalistic view of causality. And so I want to get into those issues in a minute. So there's 3 kind of questions that will be the sort of the which we will orbit around in this talk. First, the question of what can we know about the sending of messengers? What do human beings are rationally able to know about this matter? Secondly, how does the sending of messengers from God relate to the divine attributes? And finally, how are prophets identified, or more specifically, how do miracles identify a prophet? And what I want to suggest with al-Maturidi, who will be my first figure, which makes sense, of course, as the eponym, is that there's a deep, coherent structure to his own approach to the topic. And I will argue this coherent structure is not fully matched by subsequent developments in this early tradition. And so to go into al-Maturidi's position, Maturidi's position, I'm just going to sort of extract this from his Kitab al-Tawheed, and I'm not going to attempt to give all of the sort of passages and justifications in this kind of talk. And I also should mention that some of this is still inchoate, and I'm working on these kind of topics as I come to know both al-Maturidi and his school better. But his basic position is that there is a rational necessity for God to send messengers. And he gives a number of arguments for this position. The most characteristic of the arguments that he uses occurs in the opening part of Kitab al-Tawheed, in this kind of introduction that begins the book. And later it reoccurs in summary in his section on prophethood. And the basic structure of the argument is that we've already presumed that we've established by rational argument that there is a wise creator of the world. So this would require some kind of preamble in terms of a cosmological argument of some kind, a teleological argument. So we've established that there is indeed a wise creator of the world. And then when we come on to the topic of prophetology, the argument goes, it would not be wise for God to create the world without rational agents being able to sustain within the world. So these rational agents need to be able to sustain in the world. And he thinks that without God sending prophets, it's not possible for society to sustain, and rather it would ultimately collapse into bloodshed. And this is not his only argument, but this is one of the interesting arguments that he does bring forward. The idea here is that, and this is one of the things, is that he does think that we can have rational knowledge of some basic moral realities about right and wrong to some degree, but that ultimately, without that additional guidance of the prophet, there isn't a stable society that can be put into place. You need to have this additional revealed element to avoid this kind of bloodshed and corruption, which would then not lead to a sustained society in which people could come to then know God, and therefore this would be foolish. Therefore, because we can rationally make this argument, we know it is necessary that God will send prophets, that a God who is wise will send prophets. He has some other arguments as well, but this one will suffice for characterizing the position. And it's the first one that he brings. So this kind of puts him in the situation of saying that we should be expecting, people who are not, for example, in Revelation, human beings should be kind of expecting God to send prophets if they use their akal correctly. So what picture of the divine attributes do we have here? It's based on this idea of divine wisdom, hikmah, which is very distinctive for al-Maturidi. God does not just possess knowledge of what is or is to be, but he has this kind of attribute of wisdom. What this effectively means, if you go into his theological usage of wisdom, is that God always acts according to wisdom, and it is inconceivable for him to contravene it. So something may be logically possible, in the sense that God has the power to realize something that is within, we can say, logical space. But due to God's wisdom, it is inconceivable or metaphysically impossible that God will ever will that particular feature. So, for example, it's inconceivable that God will just not send prophets, because that wouldn't be wise, and we know God is wise. So, we can sort of see in Maturidi some similarity to Mu'tazili notions of wisdom, but importantly, the divine wisdom is construed as an essential attribute of God in a Sunni manner, or in a proto-Sunni manner in Maturidi's case, and you can get into the weeds on exactly how and when Sunnism forms. But he has this sense of this because of who God is, because of God's own nature. It's inconceivable that God will do certain things or will not do other things. Yet this is not compromise God's omnipotence. That's his kind of theological move. Now, today we're more focusing on how this relates to prophecy, but this is really important, this idea of wisdom that he has. So also another feature of wisdom for al-Maturidi is that it will, because of what we know about God's wisdom, it allows human beings a degree of rational access to what must be, to the necessity of what God will create or not create. And therefore, the world is inherently intelligible. And as such, we can make these kind of judgments. So we can say things like, it is inconceivable that God will not send prophets, for example. And this comes up in many places in his theology, but here it's significant for this idea of the necessity of sending prophets. But when we know that God sends messengers, it does not mean we know who is the prophet, which individual who may be making various types of claims, who is a true prophet and who is not. And so here the miracles come in as this confirming of who it should be identified as a prophet. For al-Maturidi, there are two aspects to this. First, they must have an exemplary character and grow up amongst their people, such that there's no doubt about their truthfulness. And this is obviously seen he thinks of this in its fullest extent in the Prophet Muhammad. But this is a general principle. And secondly, prophets must be able to perform signs, is preferred term, ayat, that come from an exceptional nature, such that only a divine endowment could provide this nature. And so he talks about this, and he writes about this in some detail, that people are seen to have been upright, and that their upbringing to be truthful, and this to be widespread, that it was always known amongst their people that they were, of the most honest, and so on. So there's this kind of, already we're seeing a fairly kind of naturalistic criteria that people will know their own communities, and they will know about this individual and their uprightness. Secondly, these people then, despite having this upright life, despite it being known that they cannot do some certain things, they haven't studied for this, or it's just impossible to even achieve through study, they nevertheless realize these very particular miracles. So these things are, as he says, outside the natures of the people of insight in that particular subject, and impossible to aspire to its like or attain its essence through study. So this is how he's looking at this. Interestingly, he does talk also about sorcery, because it seems that sorcery could in some cases achieve effects similar to miracles, and he says that the origin of knowledge of sorcery was actually from the heaven. So it was coming from originally from the heaven, and here he's possibly referencing the Harut al-Matrut story, but the people forgot its origin and transmitted it by study. And he thinks that the point of the prophet is this person has not studied for these abilities. Now, what he does not say is quite telling. He does not speak about breaking of the divine custom, about the kharq al-ada, as Ash'aris and as later Maturidis do. And this, I think, relates to his divine action model. I've argued or arguing elsewhere that Maturidi does affirm real causation in the world. He has a kind of concurrentism in which both God's action and human action come together in the manifestation of each causal property within each human action in the world, and more generally with the causal properties of non-human things as well. So there's a real causation in play, and therefore he's not an occasionalist in which God has a merely customary causal order, which is then broken in order to establish miracles. And I'll come on to that point in a minute. So this means, that miracles are not something outside of causal reality, but they are essentially just part of God's wise design for the world. He has a very particular way. They are ennoblements or bequeathments or bequeathings given to the prophet who at a particular time with a particular need in order to establish, or the messenger to establish his message to his people, and in order to lay out a challenge, and it relates to a special nature that the prophet has in order to be able to do that as created and sustained by God. So in my reading, the consistency of this is also mandated by divine wisdom, both for the you know, as we've been saying, for the necessity of sending prophets, but also to the causal order and even to miracles. And so a messenger, based on Maturidi's interpretation of verse 42:31, is someone who has to be someone who's received revelation from God in one of three ways: coming through an inspiration, especially in dreams, a communication in a created medium, such as Moses hearing God's address, or visitation by a messenger angel. And this experience changes the nature of the prophet, such that at the proper place and time, the miracle is realized. So there has to be, some of this is a bit of an extension on what, strictly speaking, in Maturidi's books. He's often responding in polemical or exegetical context, so he's not necessarily spelling out all aspects of his theory. So there's some reconstruction going on here. But this and also some of this has been worked out with my colleague David Jalajal. But what I would say is that what seems to be the case is, if you have a causal necessity going on, you need to have these causal chains for everything to come in its proper place within the system. You can't have breaks in that, because that would be occasionalism. So if you don't have an occasionalist model, then you have to have some way that the prophet becomes a prophet and is given this nature that then is able to realize a miracle at the appropriate time. And it seems that Maturidi sees this as coming through revelation. He writes about this. He at least alludes to this kind of idea. Okay. I want to now turn to the tradition after Maturidi. And what we will see is we will notice something interesting. Many of the main transmitters of his legacy adopt this first or second principle, so talking about the necessity of sending messengers, but they do not adopt this third principle related to the miracles, i.e. this concurrentist approach to miracles in any notable way. So first, we can go to Abu Salama al-Samarkandi. This is a kind of a grand student of Maturidi, kind of still there in the 4th century, it seems, and very much, if not discussing Maturidi's work by name, clearly drawing on his arguments again and again. And he makes the same kind of argument in summary. He says that God created people to endure for a time, and created for them that by which they are rewarded and assisted. And as their differences result in them perishing, so their differences, i.e. their arguing and fighting, would result in them dying, a messenger from God is necessary for them due to their need for him. Al-Samarkandi does not speak at any length about miracles, as far as I can see, but in another section relating to human action prior to prophecy, he notes that the second, so it's prior to prophecy in the sense of within the structure of his book. So before he talks about the prophethood, he notes that the secondary effects of human actions are not actually the human beings in reality. So this is this famous principle that's associated with occasionism, that human actions further effects are not really theirs, but they're only ascribed to that person for legal purposes. And this is something that emerges in later Kalam texts as well. So what this is showing, although he doesn't seem to fully spell it out, I think already even in Samarkandi we're getting an anticipation of a kind of more occasionalist approach to human action, which would play into this question of miracles, I think. Now turning to al-Bazdawi, this is now into the kind of late 5th century, so about a century on. Whereas for Maturidi and Samarkandi, there's no direct influence of Asherism. It's detectable. It's too early for that. It's too localized in Samarkand. But Bazdawi is between Samarkand and Bukhara, and he's in that traveling around in that region. He's debating with Asheris, and he's very much actually influenced by the Asheri school in a number of areas. Yet he's also strongly holds us to a number of characteristic Maturidi positions, and this makes his thought very interesting, but also quite challenging. I've been teaching Bazdawi for the last year and a bit at Cambridge Muslim College, working through his text with the students, and we've uncovered all sorts of interesting things which maybe escape a kind of quick reading of his book. And what he actually does in one place is he actually more or less reconstructs al-Maturidi's argument about the necessity for prophets, sending prophets. He says that effectively that there is a need for people to be guided for various rulings, for injustices, for new occurrences, and preventing wrongdoing. And there needs to be a leader to rule the people. And the leader needs to know the extent of restrictions to put upon the people in order to be able to rule them and basically establish order. And this extent of restrictions is not known by reason. And so, therefore, it is necessary, he says, that there comes from God Most High, with respect to them, restrictions, commands, prohibitions, and acts of worship, so that the traces of servitude becomes manifest, and that therefore sending messengers, he says, is rationally praiseworthy. But when you see that he says it's necessary, and some of his other things that he's mentioning, the overall impression here is that it is actually a necessity. Now, this is interesting because Bezdawi is he doesn't explicitly rely on this idea of wisdom or hikmah very often. He will hold and he will negate, he will say in places that what God does is wise, but he generally wants to deny that God can be foolish. And he says that we can't really know what the wisdom of God consists in. So it seems to me that he's more cautious about the extent of knowledge of wisdom than, for example, Maturidi or Samarkandi, and even actually Abu Mu'in and Nasafi. Bezdawi is seemingly more close to the Ash'ari position. This has been noted in the scholarship on some of these matters. But yet, nevertheless, it does seem that when he gets into these polemical back and forth dialectics with the Mu'tazila and others, he does seem to affirm what we can call a wisdom criterion. For instance, he rejects the possibility that a false prophet could do a miracle, as it would make it impossible to tell a false from a true prophet, and these kind of things. And in other places as well, he seems to have some aspects that relate to this. Yet when he comes to human action, and I should point out for Bezdawi, he doesn't explicitly discuss miracles in terms of kind of khalq al-ada and so on, as far as I can see. He deals with them before looking at human action, and he just mentions that, of course, these are mu'jiz, and these miracles can't be replicated, and they're proofs, but he doesn't go into kind of exactly how this relates to things such as causality. When he comes to human action, he clearly shows that everything just has its conventional effects, i.e. has an occasionalistic view. And when he's in a certain polemic, he is pressed on a certain question. Maybe I don't need to get into the details of it, but he's pressed on a certain verse, which the messengers were sent so that humanity does not have an argument against God after the messengers. This is 4:165. He's pressed on this verse for various reasons to do with human action. And he ends up mentioning that he says the sending of messengers is for additional explanation and to remove hardship from the people. So he seems to, in this context, rather than in the context on prophecy, where he seems to be drawing more from Maturidi models, when he's coming into some arguments that are more within the frame of divine action and just responding to a polemic, he seems to move to a more, we could say, Ash'ari or even Ahl Hadith kind of model that's not affirming a wisdom criterion. So he seems to have some kind of deep, I feel, some deep conflicts within the system of thought. And I've noticed this more generally, but this is an example, I would say. And I think the essence of this can be expressed as follows, and I'm still working on this argument. So if someone wants to point out flaws in it, I'm very happy for that, because it's just something that I've been coming up with more recently. But it seems to me that if the logic of hikmah is necessary for, if this is the logic, as we've been saying, of God's wisdom, that messengers are necessary, then it would seem to make it necessary for them to have a way to be known, i.e. to have miracles that work also grounded in wisdom as these sort of necessary expressions at the correct time and place to identify the prophet. But it would seem that the logic of occasionalism requires that any given miracle may occur or may not, because the logic of occasionalism is that anything that's logically possible, God can create it or doesn't. And if God gives miracles, that's his grace, and of course he's got the freedom to do that. But there's no necessity involved in this sense. So I think there's something of a conflict that's just arriving about where the miracles and relate to the divine attributes, rather than grounded in wisdom. For the occasionalist, you ground in God's will, and therefore you don't get to the same kind of necessary criterion. So I think there's a slight conflict there. We'll see this again with Abu Mu'in al-Nasafi, who's my last figure for today. So he's even more open about his position on this matter, and he goes into some more details. He acknowledges there's an emerging difference of opinion on this question of necessity. So he acknowledges that some of the Ahl Sunnah go with this idea that prophets are merely rationally possible. And I think this is actually also I think what I should have said, al-Bazdawi on the face of it says, although when you get into his position, he seems to still have this necessity locked in there in the arguments he's making. But Nasafi is acknowledging there's kind of an ikhtilaf on this, and that actually but he says that the sort of the verifiers of our group, of our companions, so kind of the Maturidi, Hanafi Maturidi, so to speak, the better view, we could say, is to still affirm this necessity. And he also uses an argument that he doesn't. He may use that argument somewhere, but what I've seen is he actually uses a different argument related to benefit and harm and needing to know the difference. We've sort of seen something similar from Bazdawi as well. And therefore that we need to have necessities, and this is rationally knowable. But when he comes to the miracles, he also brings up the breaking of custom. And he gives a very nice kind of fable of a castle in which there is a giant tree that no one can shake except the king. And a messenger goes out and tries to convince people that he represents the king, but they disbelieve in him. And then he calls out in this very loud voice, and the king hears him and shakes the tree to prove that, of course, he is a genuine messenger. So you can see the clear analogy here to God and the idea of the khalqa ada. And he opposes this, and he says this is the opinion of the Mutakallimin. And then he opposes so this idea of breaking the sort of the custom with what he calls the view of the philosopher, in which it is it's a kind of divine action that outstrips natural and mental power. So what I'm kind of proposing here is that what he is calling the view of the philosopher, at least in a modified version, is what we're finding in al-Maturidi. And this relates back to a further contention that I have, that to really understand al-Maturidi's theology, rather than reading him through his later members of his tradition, it's often more useful to read him through earlier figures, particularly what we have of the philosophy of al-Kindi and others. And you'll start to see that he's got this quite different positions, of course, that do relate to what develops after him. And he goes on, al-Nasafi, to say there's no difference in the essence of a true prophet and a lying claimant, i.e. a mutanabi, a liar who's claiming prophecy, except that God breaks custom for one upon his truth and not for the other. So what he means here is that really the only way we can know anything about the truth, he's kind of left this idea of knowing the good character and these kind of things, but really the logic of khalqa ada is that the way we know is, does God break custom in the requisite way for the prophet upon the call to prophecy, and that's our criterion for knowing. Now, in other places he mentions that, and this is unlike Bazdawi, who wants to keep a firm, even though both Bazdawi and Nasafi are occasionalists. In the case of an Bazdawi, he's still kind of arguing for a quite distinct position from al-Ash'ari, while Nasafi more or less accepts that he's got a view of Kasb, or a modified version of the same theory, and he just, he does bring some distinctions, but he's more, say, accommodating towards that perspective. And this is, I think, reflecting what we see as the growing kind of Sunni consensus on a lot of these issues. particularly on the divine action model. You see this from Besnik onwards, atomism, occasionalism, and so on. And this really defines both the classical Maturidi school and, of course, the classical Ash'ari school. Now, I still think, despite this or because of this, I don't think, from what I can read of an-Nasafi, that he's able to resolve the same basic problem I've been raising. How can wisdom necessitate the sending of messengers if it does not necessitate the miracles with which they are known? And I want to put this in another way, just to try to make clear my contention here. We have a world that God, solely by his grace, makes regular, according to Nasafi. There is no necessity to this regularity or to its intelligibility. It's just God's grace. He wills it that way. It's how it happens to be. Further, he has allowed, so this is based on occasionalist principles. Further, he has allowed some limited derogation from the regular pattern to allow miracles to be realized if he wills. But if this is the case, so on an occasionalist picture, there can be no necessity to the sending of messengers. For it to be necessary to send them, there would have to be, for one, there would have to be everything couldn't just be whatever God wills without the criterion of wisdom. But more pressing for the current argument is there would need to be a guaranteed way to be able to know them. So wisdom would be needed to make that is needed to make it necessary to send them. This would also have to condition the operation of the actions, i.e., to make it such that miracles would come under this. Therefore, they would have to be necessary in their correct conditions. So it'd have to be inconceivable that they were unable to perform any given miracle. But that necessity is exactly what al-Maturidi and the philosopher affirm, and the classical Maturidis reject. Because under occasionalism, miracles are meant to be the grand exceptions to causal consistency. If they themselves are necessary, then there really is no occasionalism to speak of. So this is the contention that the logic of occasionalism seems to my mind, conflict in quite a fundamental way with the logic of causal necessity and the divine wisdom necessitating the sending of prophets because of the need for the miracles to confirm them. So just in conclusion, al-Maturidi's approach to sending prophets relies on a strong treatment of divine wisdom as an attribute. It's used in specific arguments that mandate a rational necessity for prophets to be sent, and for their miraculous proofs to be part of the same causal world underpinned by wisdom. This idea was powerful, the former idea about sending the necessity of prophets and the kind of the social role that they play as guarantees against disharmony and filling in us knowing that they fill in certain elements of human life that need to be fulfilled. And so it's adopted by many of the subsequent tradition. But as I argue, later figures had abandoned his concurrentist divine action model and embraced occasionalism, they were left with a puzzling combination of this necessity of sending messengers, but without necessity in their miracles to support them. And so, on the other hand, the Ash'aris who are taking this, or the Maturidis that take this other view, they argue that it's merely possible, rationally possible, that God sends prophets, and it's actual, it happened, and miracles are possible and also actual by God's grace to support them. This view, I think, may have its own difficulties, which we can't get into, but it's at least consistent. Classical Maturidis, on the other hand, by taking on the Ash'ari occasionist presumption, seem to undercut the logical coherence of their approach to the necessity of prophethood, insofar as they take that view. So that's my discussion for today, and I very much welcome the comments and questions and discussion that can follow.
Thank you very much, Raymond. And again, as everyone here is accustomed to, please raise the yellow hand and please notify that you want to ask a question, and then go ahead and unmute yourself. If I may, take the opportunity and kind of I have quite a few questions, and of course I'm not going to ask them all, but it's been quite striking to me, and I was wondering if you could speak to this in turn, not only as someone who has studied the classical Maturidi tradition, but also as someone who engages with Maturidi thought as a contemporary theologian. So to me, I do find it striking, this argument of the stable society, and kind of the absence of what would seem to be the more grounded theological argument of the primary function of prophets as those providing the path to salvation. And just to bring as an example, I mean, one of these students, I've kind of taken the freedom of turning the course on Sira that I'm teaching more of a course on prophecy, raise the objection to this stable society argument by saying that, well, Roman and Greek societies, they managed to establish societies of laws and rules and so on and so forth, successfully so, or to a certain extent. But what I feel that is kind of missing from this argument is precisely the idea of providing the path to salvation. And the second thing I wanted to ask, and I was wondering if you could jump into a conversation that has started in the series of these seminars. So we had Frank Griffel here who spoke about the Ash'ari tradition in conversation with the Falasifa, and particularly, at least in my case, as someone dealing with modern debates, it has been particularly important, this idea of the acquisition of prophecy. And so when we had Sajjad Rizvi here, and so he argued that that is somehow a misreading of Ibn Sina. The idea that philosophers like him kind of assumed that prophecy can be acquired. So I was wondering if you could kind of engage also with this question of acquisition of prophecy from a Maturidi point of view, and thank you, and looking forward to the questions from the rest of you here. Thank you.
Oh, sure. Okay, so on the first point, as I said, Maturidi himself has a number of arguments. I just raised this first one, which I think is prominent and interesting. So he doesn't only limit the arguments to that, but I think even within this argument, I think that he's talking about the preconditions for this salvation, so to speak. So he's saying that it's only, I would read him as saying, it's only when you have a stable society that doesn't just fall into chaos that you then have the conditions in place where people are able to, for example, rationally come to know their Lord, or come to worship according to the Prophet. And he does talk about religion as well. So I think that he doesn't see it just in a sort of single dimension. Like, yes, there is this stopping corruption, but there's more to it as well, including worship, giving this kind of things that can't be rationally determined about how to worship God, including sustaining so that one is able to use their mind in the appropriate way and travel that path. So I think there's more to it, especially if you consider Maturidi's own kind of various arguments there. But it's a good point to raise. With the issue of acquisition, so as far as I am aware, it's very clear that prophecy is not something that someone can gain through good deeds, or this is kind of very well-known point, that it's something that God bestows or he ennobles someone with, and the way that we're kind of or the way that I'm kind of passing this out in terms of the kind of theological system for at least for al-Maturidi himself, is that the prophet is the one who receives a type of revelation in one of these kind of three modes, and that's something that comes essentially from the unseen world. And so no one, however much one wants to practice or engage in meditation or in worship or in any kind of good deeds, it won't, because God is free. There's certainly no necessity for God to make any individual a prophet. So although the argument is saying that it's necessary that God sends prophets. Who God sends as a prophet remains effectively God's free choice, and it's not something that is acquired through good deeds. While I guess to some extent, the person who's the wali, although there's still divine favor being granted to this person, there is something more of a kind of personal practice involved in becoming, at least in putting the preconditions in place. Well, I think with a prophet, they could be anyone. I mean, obviously they are I guess God's wisdom would be to choose people that have only good qualities and are suitable and grow up in the environment where people know them. All these things that he's mentioning, but who that is, of say there's 1,000 people that meet that criteria, still God chooses just one of them. So I don't know if that answers the question, but that's the best I can do off the top of my head.
Thank you. If I can actually ask a question that was written in the chat. So Laura asked the question, I guess, what can we deduct from this conception of human nature? So I'll read the question. The argument that you mentioned for the necessity of prophethood, without it people would just fight, is fascinating. It suggests a low view of human nature, and I wondered if this was specific to this argument, or if you have noticed any broader trends for this view in Maturidi's thought.
Sure. Hi, Laura. Basically, he does sort of, for me, it parallels, if you look in the context of how he deals with it, he talks about the human being as the microcosm, al-Maturidi, and the way he thinks about this is that, human beings, and this is like not unique to Maturidi, this is like got a philosophical root as well in Kindi and others, but the human being is kind of got all of these different tabai, different nature, different conflicting natures that make up our kind of various whims and desires and who we are. And then what is required to regulate those is the aql, is the intellect. And so the intellect comes and it allows us to sort of, as it were, subdue our desires and choose what is felicitous for us. And so likewise, at the kind of macro level, society is made up of all these kind of competing factions and groups and people fighting and going after their own interests. And you kind of need some kind of subduing element, which is in effect the prophet. And I think even by extension, this gets used as the basis for like the argument of the imam in the sense of the caliph, right? Now, Maturidi himself, as far as I've seen in his Kitab al-Tawhid, he doesn't go into the chapter of it doesn't have the chapter of Imama, but it is there in other Kalam books, and there's a hint to it, for example, in Bazdawi, that this person, this leader, isn't necessarily just a prophet, but by extension, it's it becomes it becomes the rational argument for the need for the caliphate, is basically that you have the same idea of the need for a central kind of authority, a political authority. So you get some very interesting discussions here. So I do see al-Maturidi in the Kitab al-Tawhid in that early part. He's almost acting as a political philosopher to some extent, and the comparisons with al-Farabi, who is roughly his contemporary, are quite striking, even if they're working from slightly different perspectives and models and influences and so on. So yeah, whether that's a low view of human nature, I mean, maybe he's just a realist to some extent, but yeah, there's that's there. This idea of the tabai and so on is very prominent in his thought, and so there is this idea of kind of this lower passion and will and desire that's overcoming if we don't use our intellects.
Thank you, Raymond. So again, while waiting for others to kind of think of their questions, you kind of hinted to this idea of this terminology of Sunnism and proto-Sunnism, and so especially in this kind of ongoing discussion of exploration of the making of Sunnism. I was wondering if you want to touch upon that as to how these discussions about prophecy are informing the process of making of Sunnism or the early forms of proto-Sunnism.
Right, this is a great question. It's not something that I'll just be speaking from my impressions here. I've not something I've worked on specifically, but it's very clear that Sunnism does have specific approaches to prophethood. There's certain characteristic doctrines, perspectives, and so on. And these become, shared amongst, the sort of Sunni schools that, and increasingly over time. So I think this is an important element. I'd have to, you'd have to look carefully at, other schools to see how significant that is. It doesn't seem to me to be the main sort of dividing line in any sense. It seems to be that most of these dividing lines are with not, are actually, if you look at the books of Kalam, they tend to discuss the kind of Barahima and the Sumaniya. Basically they're talking about purported kind of sort of Hindu groups and Buddhist groups, and sometimes discussions with Christians and Jews who don't accept the Prophet Muhammad. So the at least in the Kalam chapters I've been reading, the internal debates don't seem to be that intense on these questions of Nabuwah. But nevertheless, obviously there are important topics like this one about necessity versus mere possibility. But more broadly about sort of Maturidi and Sunnism, the reason I kind of slightly problematize that is that al-Maturidi nowhere refers to himself as a Sunni, right? He refers to himself as Ahl al-Haq. He refers to himself, as a Muslim, of course, and so on. So he doesn't refer to himself as being Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah. And yet, very soon after him, this does take off. And I wrote an article about his student, Rustukh, who does use this language. So that's not to say he's not holding to a lot of the characteristic Sunni doctrines. Of course, he does. He's very clearly a Hanafi and within that camp of Sunnism, so to speak. But it's interesting that that language hasn't quite reached at that place and time in Samarkand, at least with him. That's not quite reached him yet. Someone like Bazdawi, that's his whole claim. But who he means by Sunnism is excludes, not just the obvious groups, but also excludes the Hanbalis. It excludes, or is at least extremely ambivalent towards al-Ash'ari and Ibn Kullab, although kind of saying that they're the closest, but yet they're not fully part of Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah. So you've got this stage before Sunnism becomes the kind of term that's being used, and then you've got, even when it does come into use within the Maturidi tradition, it's used basically to talk about kind of Hanafi scholars and broadly the masses, but very much associated with doctrines, for example, of Taqween and other sorts of characteristic Maturidi kind of doctrines. So it takes time for it to flow into this more general agreed Sunni consensus in the sort of into the classical and post-classical periods.
Thank you. We have a question first from Ruggero and then from Leila. So yeah, Ruggero, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much. I was wondering this question of knowledge of prophecy, which you raised, and in a general manner, this discussion whether prophecy is a consequence of God's will or of God's wisdom, and then this relation between necessity of prophecy and knowledge of it. For which audience was this written somehow? Because I'm asking this question because in the Kitab al-Shifa, which I have been studying by Qadi Iyad, he treats this question of knowledge of prophecy, or rather of the nature of prophecy, or he calls it the qadr of the Nabi, so the dignity or the azim qadrihi, so the enormous dignity or the preeminence of the prophecy, how we can know the standing, the rank of the prophet. And for him, it's, I mean, he's an Asharite, of course. It's only God who can make known to mankind, okay, the qadr, or the standing, the rank, the nature of the prophet. And he specifies through qawlihi wa af'alihi. So qawl is revelation and af'alihi is miracles, but it's also the character of the prophet. So his khuluq and his even his beauty, his external, I mean, the way he appears, etc. I mean, his whole personality is actually an action of God, which makes known his meaning for salvation to mankind. So this is somehow the argument of Qadiyat. But he wrote for a Muslim audience. Okay, he states this clearly in the beginning. So it's not rather the question of proving the truthfulness, you know, of the prophecy of Muhammad, but it's rather what is the meaning of this prophecy and how can we know about this? And he treats this in this manner. So I was wondering if you can say something about this aspect. The second question, what about the notion of election? Does it play any role? I mean, you said something about revelation, which I found interesting. I don't know if I understood it well, but that revelation causes prophecy or creates prophecy in the person, and then somehow changes the nature of this person. I don't know if I understood it well. Maybe is this? I mean, the idea of election, which I mean, you know, creates this change, or and then if you permit, if there's time, a last question. I mean, what can we do with these questions of necessity and knowledge of prophecy and etc. in a contemporary context? You know, for, I mean, theology today. I mean, how can this give impulses for a prophetology which is able to address questions and problems and that we have today, okay, towards prophecy, towards the authority of prophecy, towards the meaning of prophecy, especially the meaning of prophecy in Muslim life. Thank you very much.
Oh, sure. Thank you for these questions. So I'll try to be quick. So audience-wise, you know, obviously, Maturidi himself, for example, is writing in Arabic. He's not. It seems his first language probably wasn't Arabic. It was probably Persian or another language, and therefore he's obviously writing for educated people of his time, people who were able to engage in the literary language of Samarkand, not necessarily all Muslims. And in fact, there's a clue in the beginning of the Kitab al-Tawheed where he kind of alludes to the Prophet Muhammad while keeping the language very general, in a way that, to me at least, suggests that he is trying to say, well, this would also apply to any person who holds to a prophetic tradition. So not to limit it just to, he kind of goes out of his way to make it generally applicable. And this maybe is connected to why he makes these kind of arguments, drawing on kind of very empirical premises. Or we would see that everything would get corrupted, and therefore, you know, these kind of arguments, he's not presupposing any particular belief, it would seem. Of course, we can expect that he's largely speaking to Muslims, but not necessarily exclusively. For the later Kalam proponents, it seems much more of an internal Muslim discourse. It's a certain discipline that deals with particularly, you know, internal debates of the community. The second question was about was it about election? So this was, as I say, this is the slightly speculative element, but and it's probably difficult to get into it. Maybe I shouldn't have raised it without being able to go deeper into it. But it relates to kind of what can it mean to elect a prophet according to some of the kind of ontological assumptions that Maturidi seems to be making. And it appears that part of this seems to be there's this experience of revelation, and that this would allow a kind of the kind of basically, in order for the prophet to have this nature, because you rule out God just divinely intervening in the order, because that's occasionalism. So you have to have some kind of, you have to have some kind of causally consistent order based on divine wisdom, in which things link up in a certain pattern. And so therefore, if prophets have this special nature that allows them to accomplish miracles in the right time, there needs to be a mechanism for how they gain this nature. And then the mechanism seems to be this connection to this experience of revelation. So some of this is reading between the lines about what would need to be posited in order to make Maturidi's system work. And I do acknowledge that it's not an explicit doctrine as much as a reading of his system to make it work. But yeah, it's a fascinating topic. Finally, today, well, I think today you get back to we're again in this, especially in the West and so on, and we're in this world where the assumptions of, well, we're all Muslims and we all believe this anyway, isn't there anymore. And therefore, Maturidi's arguments, I do feel, have a renewed vigor, because he's making these arguments that are based on these kind of, we can see that, these arguments based on intelligibility, based on the world has meaning, the world has telos, the world has intelligibility, therefore there is, a divine intelligence there. That obviously that's a step to make. That's debated very vigorously in philosophy of religion departments and so on. But if you do get to the point of, okay, so there is this intelligent creator, then I guess this kind of argument gives the opportunity to say, well, necessarily, if we've granted these premises, we end up with that this creator must communicate, and through prophecy. And so whether these arguments work or not, whether they stand up robustly to the best criticism of today is a different matter. But certainly, I think it's an interesting area of further research and discussion if you can go beyond arguments for God to arguments to prophecy, which would definitely be needed if you're going to have a rational defense of Islam. For those who want to do that. Yeah.
Thank you, Raymond, very much. Leila has a question. Thank you, Leila.
Thank you, Ramon. It was a really excellent presentation. I enjoyed it. I have a couple of questions. The first one is very quick one. You mentioned that he never speaks of Ahl al-Sunnah as such, but Ahl al-Haq. I was wondering, there's another term that early Maturidis are fond of, as-Sawad al-A'zam. Does he use that at all in reference to his theology or in reference to his circle of?
I've not. I think he's clearly familiar with the Hadith, but I've not seen that. Which is you've got al-Hakim al-Samarkandi kind of at the same time, who is using Sawad al-A'zam. He actually uses Ahl al-Adl, and he even says, I think, Ahl al-Sunnah. So he's kind of has much more of this sort of, we could say, influence of this kind of traditionalist language, if we can call it that. Because obviously we know that the Ahl Hadith have been using these kind of terms going back into the 3rd century. But Maturidi seems that he wants to think of himself as Ahl al-Haq, and he just seems to be doing his own project, and for some reason he doesn't seem to use this terminology. Now maybe it can be found somewhere, but I was quite interested when I was even going through sometimes you can't find it in Kitab al-Tawhid, you find it in Ta'wilat. And I was going through the index of the good critical edition, and you even have references to Ahl al-Haq, and then like the editors of I think Ahl al-Sunnah. You look up Ahl al-Sunnah in the index, and then you get to the references, and it's Ahl al-Haq, and then the editors are going Ya'ni Ahl al-Sunnah. Like they can't really find it there, and yet they want it to be there for obvious reasons. So I think it's more of a terminological thing than a reality. In all meaningful ways, he's very much a Sunni. But for whatever reason, he's not yet using that language.
And he's not using also as-Sawad al-A'zam either.
As far as I've seen, he doesn't use that. Now, I'm not saying that I've read every word to be able to, but I've not seen that either. No.
Well, there As you may know, many master's or PhD dissertations on Maturidi's Nubuwa in Turkish, also plenty of books and articles, as well as not just on Imam Maturidi, but also later Maturidi figures. I don't know whether you read Turkish, but definitely there is a wealth and rich literature that one can consider for this kind of a study. Yeah, and one point was about when you were talking about the difference between the true prophet and false prophet. In the very beginning of Kitab al-Tawheed, Imam Maturidi, when he opens his book on with the chapter on ilm, on his epistemology, when he mentions the importance of aql, he actually presents aql as the criterion or as a tool in order to distinguish between the true prophet and the false prophet. Because if you do not have some kind of a principle that sidq, that truthfulness is right and kadhib is wrong, then you may never be able to figure out who is the true prophet. So although again, in terms of ethics, one can speak of Maturidi school as a revelational ethics, having the revelational ethics. Still, there are certain principles that one should know through the aql. So would you be able to comment a little bit on that?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so certainly the aql is really important. I think he talks about sort of another kind of reflection or inquiry to kind of make these judgments. And so this, I think, relates to this idea that this is what I'm calling kind of intelligibility, that the world is intelligible, the mind maps onto the world in a kind of meaningful way, that we, at least in general sense, understand what divine wisdom requires, and that therefore we can say it's inconceivable that, for example, a liar would be able to perform the miracles that we know to be, characteristic of a prophet. So I think that it's this kind of link between hikmah, divine hikmah, and human kind of aql, nadar, and so on, is really strong in Maturidi, and it's really important in kind of providing the foundation for revelation, for, how can we guarantee we receive from God? How do we know that God must tell the truth? All these kind of questions. I think Maturidi has a really strong response to these things, and I think that these can be quite thorny issues if you don't have this kind of more strong reading of divine wisdom and, of course, of human rationality. So in my own kind of more constructive work, I have sort of strongly championed these kind of approaches. This is why I call my book Transcendent God, Rational World, to say, well, how do we know about the transcendent God? Well, because we've got this rational world that lets us get there, and also that vouchsafes for us revelation. So this has been something that I've been arguing for a while in various ways. I mean, the reason I got into even the Maturidi tradition to some extent was I was interested in Quranic studies, and I realized that you kind of you needed a rational underpinning if you were going to believe, rationally argue for the Quran. Of course, you could have a spiritual opening that just gives you a certainty that goes beyond rationality. That's fine. But if you want to kind of have a rational case that you can appeal to beyond just a shared intuition or a shared feeling or a spiritual experience, then I feel that the Maturidi school gives a very strong way to do that within still the kind of Sunni paradigm. So yeah, I don't know if that fully answers the question, but that was what's come to my mind.
In a way, I think the argument can be made that it's hard to think of any of the theological madhabs that doesn't kind of emphasize. I mean, as when Leila asked the question, I was thinking of this even a Hanbalite like Ibn al-Jawzi, right? He says something like the aql are the eyes through which we can see the sun of revelation. So absent of the eyes, we cannot see the sun, being the argument. I think it's kind of the need to underline that it becomes almost a theological necessity, so to speak. Yes, any other questions? I know that there are people who are working here. Yes, Ruggero.
Yes, coming back to the question of rationality and, as you said, rational defense, I mean, which is, as far as I understood, the prime motor of Kalam. I mean, why it came up in this way. But then there are, of course, different types of rationality. So today, I mean, of course, we don't have the same conception of rationality as we had, of course, in the time of Maturidi, for example, which was rather like an Aristotelian conception and model. So in a post-Kantian world, for example, I mean, in a post-Kantian type of, discourse about rationality, I mean, I suppose you know the works of McIntyre, etc., about this discussion, so I was wondering how to translate, this form of argumentation based on wisdom, which I found very interesting, of course, but how to translate it, in a way that it can, I mean, as you said, that it can be shared by somebody who doesn't, maybe share the same assumption, but in a way that the dialogue becomes possible. So, I mean, this is a very general question I'm asking, I know, but I was just came up, in this discussion, and because we have now a specialist in Maturidi Kalam here, so I was thinking I take this occasion.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I have written a little bit on McIntyre and use him in some places, and I'm finding a lot of productive thought also reading Edmund Husserl, who is very much in the post-Kantian milieu, but he's bringing up kind of interesting questions of intentionality and teleology. So I think that there are ways to kind of translate some of the core insights of, for example, this idea of divine wisdom into, I don't think it's lost just because philosophy has moved on, but I do think it's important to pay attention to how philosophy has developed and what sorts of different currents there are these days, and the different developments in particularly going into the kind of 20th century. It's not the same world anymore as was inhabited by Maturidi, but also not the same world as inhabited by the kind of post-classical traditions either. It's and some people hate that, some people thrive on that, but I think that that's one of the jobs for those who are interested in kind of a more constructive theological approach as well. I mean, I kind of try to wear both hats to some extent. That we need to think about very carefully about what resources are there for us in philosophy of the last kind of 150 years or so, and where and how can some of the things that maybe as Muslims we want to hold on to and that were dealt with in a lot of sophistication by these earlier mutakallimin, how can we deal with this? And I think that the first place where this has come up, of course, is things like the kind of Kalam argument and proving God, but obviously there's a lot more to religion than just, so to speak, proving God. And I think one of the things that opens up a lot is this question of prophecy, and it's been very much neglected. And so that makes this seminar exciting, but also a lot of work needs to be done to kind of think seriously about prophetology. In Islam, we have obviously important discussions about the divine nature, but really after that, you know, the prophetology is just, you know, it's the second part of the kalima, and there hasn't been anywhere near the attention of kind of, you know, not say equivalent, but sort of the, you know, Christology and so on, and
yes.
in Christianity, just Muslims have just not really. It almost seems to take. I mean, not. It's hard to speak in generalities, but they seem to almost take it for granted that, you know, this is just there and we're just fine and we've got it. We've got the Quran, and, you know, there's no kind of serious theological thinking sometimes, but we need it. We need, especially if we want to discuss with people who don't already agree with us. So yeah, lots of work to be done, I think.
I completely agree.
I'm very happy you actually touched upon that. We have, with Ruggero, we have asked the question to almost everyone who has participated in this seminar as to where do you see the importance of this kind of conversations. And so there, it seems like, at least with the people that we've talked to, there is almost a consensus that this is like a neglected area. So it seems like we're almost building a consensus here. But even in putting this seminar series together, yes, it is exciting, but in a way, as you start thinking about it, you start becoming aware of the things that you're leaving uncovered, because you have so many weeks, etc., and so many topics, and you become aware that there are so many other aspects that need to be discussed. But we have a question from Mahbouba Hami, our PhD fellow here. Mahbouba, please go ahead. You can unmute yourself and ask the question.
Thank you for your presentation. And I have a quick question about tabaya, about nature. Is something like fitrat? You mean that both of them are the same or they are different in your presentation? Thank you.
Yes, so I would say that tabaya is not the same as fitra, but it could overlap in some respects. So tabai in general, you know, is kind of an ontological category for al-Maturidi. He sees the whole world as being kind of these different tabai coming together in various ways. Now, when it comes to the human being would also have to be these different conflicting tabai, but then overall we could say there might be some sort of aggregate tabi'ah, and to some extent in a kind of more, we could say, in a specific ethical and moral and religious way, to some extent, we could sort of see this as equivalent to this idea of fitra. So I think, you know, it's kind of different discourses. Fitra is a revealed term that Maturidi engages. Actually, I'm writing on fitra for another project. But fitra is a revealed term. It's not something that I mean, he doesn't, not to say that he doesn't think we could come across it in the world or in some sense empirically, but his motivation for that term is from where it appears in the Quran and the Hadith. And then I think if he was to explain, well, what is this fitra, then I think, yes, it would amount in some respects to aspects of the tabai possibly, but maybe also aspects of what he refers to as aql. So I wouldn't necessarily rule out, because even, you know, on the ontological plane, even the aql would seem to, in some respects, have to be built up from the kind of natures of all things. So I think it depends on which discourse, with you know, what level we're looking and how we're trying to deal with him. And I'm still kind of puzzling these things out myself as well. But I would say, you know, they're distinct concepts, but there might be some way in which fitra is in some sense emergent from tabai. That would be my best guess at the moment.
Since I don't see immediately like a raised hand, Raymond, I was wondering if, like, I was thinking this as I heard Ruggero's question. So about thinking about you know, this assumption of the post-Kantian, you know, way of thinking. I was wondering, I mean, because when we first talked together about you kind of presenting in this seminar series, you kind of mentioned, if I'm not mistaken, that you have engaged in this material for your teaching at the Cambridge Muslim College, and precisely because of the nature of the institution at Cambridge Muslim College, and thinking also about our own context here at the Center of Muslim Theology, I was wondering if you can actually speak to, about these questions on the question of prophecy in the context of teaching practice.
Yeah, I would say that my remit as a teacher, I'm teaching kind of a undergraduate theology course as part of our BA program, and we do in the second and third years, and I'm currently teaching a group that I've had since the second year. So, and we do a kalam. So we're trying to cover all the main abwab of kalam, as well as from a manual, as well as you read in the Arabic and so on, and trying to be complete, do a complete job without necessarily having the time to read absolutely every word. But then also we have discussions that go beyond the text we happen to be reading to go into kind of comparative discussions, contemporary discussions, and so on and so forth. So, obviously in the context of an undergraduate degree, you can't cover everything. I think we had about 3 weeks for prophecy overall, and we read material, we discussed what was going on. Some of the things that I presented today came out of some of the debates and discussions we've been having about how things fit together. And I've gone through different models of prophecy. Also, I talked a bit more in a contemporary sense about kind of theories of revelation that we have today, different theories that have been used to kind of look at, rethinking revelation, some of those challenges that have been brought up. So, I see my kind of teaching job as to expose students to the kind of main discussion through a representative manual and put that on the table, and then as well go beyond that to try to raise some interesting questions that are of relevance today. But there's always only so much one can do in that context. So I found it very interesting. I found students very engaged with the ideas, but yet there was a lot more that could be covered, maybe going into the future, and especially if we have more people writing in this area and we have more good secondary literature, it would really help. Because one thing I found is when I was going through the kind of core discussions of the divine attributes, there's quite a lot out there, more or less. When you get into these kind of discussions of things like prophecy, sin, these kind of issues, in terms of contemporary discussions, constructive discussions by sort of Islamic theologians in English, which obviously is the language I'm sharing for students, there's very little. And we need people developing these materials, as well as, the more historical approaches, of course.
Perhaps it's time to think of coming up with a text, a teaching text for that. But yes, Ruggero, please go ahead.
If there's time, no other question. Otherwise,
no, please, yeah, go ahead.
No other question. Okay, just continuing our interesting discussion. I'm putting something in the chat which I wrote some years ago, and I would be interested what you think, because I tried to. I mean, this was about jihadist prophetology, and how theology, can in some sense disarm this combat theology. Okay, I'm calling just jihadist prophetology, a sort of combat prophetology. It has the aim of a cultural or political fight, etc. So, so this is just one extract from this. It is inherent to the theological definition of prophecy in Islam that the figure of the prophet is not available or not at the disposition of any worldly agenda. Accordingly, it is not the agenda which determines the scope and goal of Muhammadan prophecy, but the prophet is himself the agenda to the extent that he represents and enacts God's revelation of his word. Because God's word is the unique and unavailable source of the prophet's authority, this authority cannot be submitted to anything else, and certainly not to the agenda which is confined to the achievement of the worldly, political, and utopian goal, like the total eradication of idolatry, like Said Qutb ideology, the establishment of an Islamic State, or the global dominion of Islam. So, isn't, I mean, this idea, okay, that prophecy is established and founded on revelation, so on God's act, basically. Isn't this a way also, you know, to de-ideologize, de-ideologize prophecy? Because, I mean, this is, in my opinion, one of the major problems of today, okay, that the prophet becomes, you know, a sort of figure or legitimation of a certain ideology, be it jihadist or be it, you know, a sort of social reformer, an ethical model or something, which is always a sort of worldly, you know, worldly understanding of prophecy. You know, it's limiting the scope of prophecy to this world. And here I think Kalam and theology could have a role to play in order to argue, okay, that this doesn't correspond to an Islamic definition of prophecy. So I don't know if I made myself clear enough, but would you agree that, or in what sense, I mean, to ask a question, what sense Maturidi prophetology could, you know, could be interesting to develop such a point, or wouldn't it be compatible at all, or what do you think about this?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I agree that the prophecy can't be just made the you know, the basis for some sort of worldly goal. That's not the point at all. It connects beyond that. Even if we've talked about this argument about you know, stable society and so on,
Yes,
but I think
yes,
that
exactly.
that's you know, a means to a loftier goal, I think, even in his thoughts. So it's part of this, you know, it's a means to an end to some extent. But I do think that where he would maybe question this is, if I've understood it correctly, is that the revelation can't be the basis for prophetology, because you need to establish the prophet, right? He thinks you need to establish the prophet rationally in order to have revelation. Like, you don't know, everyone claims that they've got, you know, 6 different groups claim they've all got revelation that's valid and is applicable to today. Who does have that revelation? Well, it can't be established just by the mere claim. This is what he says right at the beginning of the book. So you need some sort of proof for that, and then ultimately you need to build that rationally out. But once you have got to that point, then of course you then fully utilize what's in Revelation to help understand you know, who the prophet is and what the message is. Also, I think that I argue that Maturidi has this idea that inherently we don't start out from a kind of null space. We start out within our own traditions, within a certain space, a certain place, a certain reality. So, like, for example, today, if we were to apply it today, Muslims start out with the Quran. They don't throw away the Quran in order to argue back for it. They start out with it, but they still should be able to not need to rely on it in order to establish the necessity of prophecy. They should be able to get an independent argument for it, but it doesn't mean that we abandon it or don't start from it as a scripture. We already believe in it. So I think that that's an interesting element here as well, which might support what you're saying. So yeah, it's these are the kind of key debates. I'm gonna have to go. I'm really sorry not to just keep going, but I do have to go because I said I've got a sick kid here, and we'll need to get back to help out with that.
Wish you a quick recovery. And thank you. We've exhausted you. We've had been going for an hour and a half. Raymond, thank you very, very much for doing this. We're very grateful for your presentation. For those of you who want to join us next week, we actually have someone who's going to speak about modern debates that do come from the Maturidi tradition. Mahshid Ansari, she's going to be presenting on debates on prophecy from Iqbal and Said Nursi and so on. Thank you very, very much. Thank you to all of you who joined us here today, and wish you a good night. Stay warm.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for inviting me, and I hope to see you all in Tübingen or elsewhere in the future in person.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank
Assalamu alaikum.
you, Besnik, for organizing. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you, Leila. Thank you for coming. All right, so I'm going to end the session. Thank you and good night, everyone.